All right. And without any further ado, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. Greetings and welcome. This is the Spring 2001 discussion series from the Department of Anthropology Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, titled Race and Power, Deconstructing an Illusion. In recent months, forensic anthropologists across the United States have engaged in renewed discussions about the role of ancestry estimation in the discipline of forensic anthropology. In part, this conversation was sparked by an editorial written by our own USF Assistant Professor, Dr. Jonathan Bethard, and Binghamton University Associate Professor, Dr. Elizabeth A. DiGangi, who we have with us here today. Before I do get started, though, I would like to just quickly read our department's land acknowledgement, which acknowledges that the Department of Anthropology, we acknowledge as a department that the University of South Florida resides on the traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole, as well as other historical groups, including the Calusa and Tocobaga. Today, the state of Florida is home to the Seminole, McCuskey, Muskogee, and Choctaw, and to individuals of many other Native groups. As a department, we recognize the historical and continuing impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities, their resilience in the face of colonial and state-sponsored violence, and fully support Indigenous sovereignty. We will continue work to be more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous populations. And on that note, we also as a department acknowledge that anthropology as a discipline is rooted in racism in the guise of colonial projects. Despite efforts to end scientific racism and include a diversity of voices, racism persists in the academy today. We affirm our commitment to continuing to overcome longstanding structural barriers to access in higher education, the discipline of anthropology, and academia in general. And I encourage you to look more at some of our statements on our department website as well. I apologize for the blandness of this particular slide, but I'd like to just quickly introduce our guests today. Dr. Jonathan Bethard and Dr. Elizabeth DiGangi, both of whom are board certified forensic anthropologists. Dr. Bethard's research, much of which is actually focused in Transylvania and Romania, explores questions at the intersection of biological anthropology and archaeology, most notably in the fields of bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology. He's interested in better understanding modern human skeletal biology to improve estimation of the biological profile. In addition to his teaching here at USF, he has worked with the International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program in Colombia and Nigeria and Algeria, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross in Tbilisi, Georgia. Similarly, Dr. DiGangi's research focus is on the human rights dimensions of bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology, with specialty in the prehistoric Andes and the southeastern US. Explored changes in traditional skeletal health markers before and after major subsistence changes. Among other things, her current research program in forensic anthropology also involves gunshot trauma analysis. For 5 years, she taught and advised forensic professionals in Colombia, where she also co-created the Centro de Identificación Humana in Medellín, a state-of-the-art forensic anthropology center for the identification of human remains, continuing education, and research. And so without any more introduction, I'd like to turn the floor over to an open discussion that we can have here. Just a couple of very quick sort of housekeeping notes. We will be recording this, and so we do ask that you keep your video and your microphone muted at all times. And so please don't take it personally if we do, or one of the moderators mutes you. And also just be aware if you were to unmute yourself that this is sort of your fair warning that we are going to be recording this. The chat is open for you to please use. If you have any questions, we're going to try to get to those questions. You can also, if you would like to, or if you feel more comfortable asking a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and use that function, and we will do our best to get to you. So that you can maybe unmute and ask your question, at least unmute your mic. There is also a YouTube video that is about 15 minutes long that has been circulated. It is available currently on our department website. I think that's going to go in the chat here. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to see that particular video, it will give you a little more background and context. I like it in particular because I think as a teacher, it has some really useful information that might be useful. All right, so without any more of that introduction, I'd like to really turn this over, and just to get us going, we do want everybody to feel free and feel comfortable to ask questions. I have a number of questions though that I'd like to start with here. Maybe And so the simplest one might be just to ask if you could give a bit of background on the history of ancestry estimation in forensic anthropology. And I want to say I ask this, I'm currently teaching linguistic anthropology, and I'm always seeking, when I'm teaching, let's say, about something that's not my specialty, something like forensic anthropology, I want to try to use the right words, let's just say. And some of what I've learned from your recent writing is that this has been something that the language that we use in particular to describe some of what we're doing here is important. And I'm curious about if you could just explain a little bit more by what we mean by ancestry estimation in forensic anthropology, and even maybe how this is different between forensic anthropology and bioarchaeology. But I'll just like to turn that over to you, please.
All right. Dylan, thank you very much for, Dr. Mahoney, I should say, thank you very much for hosting us. I'd like to thank my colleagues here in the Department of Anthropology at USF for extending this invitation. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Dr. DiGangi, for joining us from New York. And we're really delighted to be here today to talk about these big questions. So to jump in with the first question about what is ancestry estimation, I think it's important to think a little bit about what forensic anthropology is and how it developed, which might make sense as to why this practice is the way that it is today. So in the previously recorded YouTube video, I explained a little bit about what forensic anthropology is, and we'll just sort of go back in time to the origins of this discipline here in the United States. And I want to couch what I'm describing to answer the question as a specific sort of development of this discipline here in the US because of the context that we're going to later be talking about. So in the early days, in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, forensic anthropology developed sort of by, I won't say as an accident, but as an application of what physical anthropologists of the day were doing with regard to understanding human skeletal biology from archaeological sites around the United States, as well as in several areas where anatomy labs were focused on skeletal biology as well. Those in particular were in Cleveland, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, and in Washington, D.C. And of course, one cannot separate the history of physical anthropology without sort of thinking about the way in which the biological race concept was rooted very firmly in the discipline, where the early thinkers of the day thought that there were distinctions, biologically based distinctions, between people who we would refer to as Black, white, whatever taxonomic label we would use, or whatever folk taxonomic label we think about. And so there was this assumption that there were skeletal differences between different groups of people. That assumption was embedded into the practice of the discipline from the get-go. When the early physical anthropologists looked at skeletons in forensic contexts or contexts where people were unidentified, they looked at the skeleton to provide whatever information they could. We call this today the biological profile. And that profile are the attributes of the skeleton, like a person's age, how old they were, how tall they were, their biological sex, etc. But in addition, there's this other component, this fourth component of the biological profile that in the early days and for much of the 20th century was called race. And people thought that you could look at skeletons and provide some kind of determination or estimation as to a person's racial identity. And this was done in many different ways in terms of the tools that were used regarding the techniques that the early folks used. But I think it's really difficult to get at this question without recognizing that it's really from the beginning that the estimation of race, as it was called for most of the discipline's history, was just part of physical anthropology, and therefore by extension was part of forensic anthropology, or what became to be known as forensic anthropology. the discipline of forensic anthropology really began to professionalize in the United States in the 1970s. We have 1972 as a hallmark year, 1977 as a hallmark year, with the formation of professional organizations related to forensic anthropology specifically. So those early scholars, those early physical anthropologists who brought with them the entrenched notion of the biological race concept, and that human groups could be investigated and looked at and parsed out into mostly Black and white categories here in the United States. That came to be part of the discipline, and that has been part of the discipline ever since. Though, to your question about language use, we began to see some changes, in the 1990s when people started to, when there was real pushback against the biological race concept, and people sort of recognized that it was a debunked and non-existent concept. Forensic anthropologists still clung to it. They, in a sense, recognized this sort of problematic nature of human identification and the way in which the biological profile was used for making identifications of people, while the biological race concept was problematic. So we saw some shifts to, for example, the term ancestry, but fundamentally not that much changed about what was actually being done in terms of the methods, the framework, et cetera. So I hope that's a bit of a snapshot. Dr. DiGangi, did I cover it?
I think you got it there, Dr.
Okay,
Bethard.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you. And it's a good introduction again to the larger issue and the larger debate that we're having. And maybe to continue along these lines, you talked a bit, Dr. Bethard, about this idea of the biological nature of race. Is this even a proper term that we should be using? And so I was wondering if I could ask, you mentioned this idea in your papers of debunking the idea, the biological race concept. I was wondering if you could just say more about this or the history of this concept. And on that note, I often do teach about this idea, and I think a lot of us, if we're in anthropology from any subfield, we're talking about, race as a biological myth. And I have heard people who are in forensics say, but, it can still be really useful to look at some of these biological realities when you're making estimations about background. What I find interesting, actually, reading your work is that actually you can actually make a lot of mistakes if you just assume that there are these connections. And so I'm curious, again, from my perspective, to hear more about your approach to this idea of race, as being, biologically a problematic concept, but also, from those of us who are coming at this from a teaching perspective, I'm really curious about how we might clarify a bit, about, maybe that there's some real problems here. It's not just about, well, it works most of the time, which I feel like, sometimes I hear that kind of an aspect to it. But please, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I'll try I'll try to take that question, Dr. Mahoney. Thank you for the invitation to the USF D&I committee of your Department of Anthropology. Thank you everybody for coming. Thanks to my colleague, Dr. Bethard as well. So I'll try to tackle that. That seemed like a three-part question there, and so I might need Dr. Bethard to jump in on part of that. But just to start with the debunking of the biological race concept. So the movement within physical anthropology to do that really goes back to sort of the early 20th century. While this idea of biological race was already well entrenched in the discipline, and I should mention that physical anthropology was developed as race science. It was developed specifically to classify people into groups based on so-called racial characteristics. And so that's why you might notice, Dr. Mahoney, since you are a linguistic anthropologist, the subtlety when we talk about, or when Dr. Bethard and I talk about physical anthropology versus biological anthropology. So physical anthropology, we're referring to yesterday when race science was what physical anthropology was about. Biological anthropology, we're referring to the discipline that we're a part of today. But there were several scholars who were engaged in trying to say, I've got problems with this idea that we can just put people into groups and those characteristics are going to be definitive of people from Africa, people from Europe, people from Asia, indigenous people. And some of those people included the first African-American physical anthropologist, W. Montague Cobb, who wrote about famous African-American track athletes in the 1930s. One of whom, incidentally and coincidentally and amazingly, was my grandfather, which is really, really just when I read that paper and opened it and saw his photograph, it was a really emotional moment for me. But he talks in that paper about because at the time, newspapers and others were saying, wow, there's got to be something special about the Negro athlete, that these athletes are doing so exceptionally well. There's got to be some anatomical, difference between, the Negro athlete and the white athlete. And so he was one of the first to say, I kind of have, a slight problem with this. Franz Boas was another anthropologist who was engaged in saying, I'm not so sure about this biological race idea. And there certainly were others, Ashley Montague, who wrote a book called Man's Most Dangerous Myth. So there were a number of anthropologists in the early to mid 20th century saying, this isn't okay. I've got some real problems with this concept. And then in the 1970s, there was a paper by Richard Lewontin, which came out, which looked at human variation and specifically said there's more variation within groups than there is between groups. And so that was really one of the starting points. There were others, but that was one of the starting points for physical anthropologists to start to say, okay, now we're starting to have some evidence that this concept is really problematic. And as Dr. Bethard mentioned, it was really in the 1990s in physical anthropology when more people started to get on board with the debunking of the concept. Although, as he mentioned, forensic anthropologists still held on to it, and there were, a number of, or in particular, two famous papers that say, well, yes, there is no biological race, but at the same time, we are really good at identifying them. And I think that was probably part one of your second questions. What are some of the mistakes that we can make, and maybe, and I'm not sure if this was exactly your question, why is it that we can do this? And I'm not sure that I want to go into the details of why it is that we are able to do it, but maybe and I want to couch that as well, because I'm not so sure that we can do it that well. But Dr. Bethard, maybe you want to talk about a little bit more about what some of the mistakes are that we can make.
Well, I think the mistakes are multifaceted, particularly with regard to this really thorny disconnect or congruence between what the forensic anthropologist might write in her report and the levels of identity to which people ascribe or place on themselves, or that their communities place on them. And this, if we think about, for example, the United States Census the categories, right? We think about those broad racial and ethnic terms, and we think about the nuances of those terms. We think about the intersectional nature of those terms. While forensic anthropologists have argued that they're pretty good at doing this, in part because they look at cases and they use as evidence the cases of people who are positively identified, we know that there's more to the story because there are a lot of unidentified people. We know, for example, that there's a national database of missing people, which are unidentified people, which numbers over 13,500 as 13,600. And in some instances, for instance, in this database, people check boxes, or there are boxes that are checked which sort of are designated about this person. Well, let's say the forensic anthropologist makes an erroneous assessment, but reports that to be true, then the wrong box is checked. There's nothing that can be done to ever fix that. If investigators think that I'm looking for person from group X, and that's what I'm doing, but the skeleton that they've investigated is really from group Y, for instance. And so forensic anthropologists have not really done a good job of even communicating some of those nuances. There's a great paper that I referenced in the webinar, the recorded webinar that was just published back in January about language use itself and the words that are reported and the variety of words that are used, particularly as we've wrestled with this transition from race estimation to ancestry estimation, and what the words are, how people use them, could a person, and how do forensic anthropologists, for example, deal with people who might have a parent from one group and a parent from another group, for instance, right? We can look to lots of examples for how intersectional identities muddy the water in terms of social classifications. And forensic anthropologists have not done a good job about this. And I would really encourage folks, we're going to talk in a bit, or we'll mention, I mentioned a webinar that Dr. DiGangi organized back in February, and I believe that recording will be available. I encourage people interested on this topic to look at a paper or presentation that was given by our colleague, Dr. Teresa Wilson from Louisiana State, who specifically tackled that issue of the problematic word of admixture and what that means and its layered degrees of problematization. And so that's just one example. And that talk that Dr. Wilson gave really eloquently described some of these problems. So we're just mired down with a lot of issues as we embark to do this historically, and how this practice has persisted up until the very present moment we're in.
That's great, thank you. I do want to just remind everyone who's here, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. But to build on this discussion that we're already having, maybe I know that you do choose to use critical race theory as a framing concept for much of the writing that you've done. And I see that there may be some connections here to some of the discussions we're having. And I was wondering if you could just maybe talk more about your decision to use critical race theory as a framing for this work.
Yeah, so, we wrote the editorial this summer and didn't mention critical race theory. And then based on some of the reading that I've been doing on my own, especially in the aftermath of the events of this past year, last summer in particular, and some of the pushback that we received after the editorial, both public and private pushback that we received. John and I talked, and I realized this needs a broader context, because us just saying, okay, we shouldn't do ancestry estimation anymore, or the point of the editorial was to say there's a problem with this one particular practice of looking at macromorphoscopic traits, which are these different variants of features on a human skull. And so we talk about that in the editorial, and then we also talk about the potential for, if we do ancestry estimation, that can contribute to the bias that we already know that law enforcement in general, racial bias that law enforcement has. But I knew that we needed to contextualize, in particular, that hypothesis that reporting that a person was African-American or Black or Indigenous or whatever in your report, you hand that over to a police officer, you hand that over to a medical legal death investigator. How does that not reinforce for them that biological race exists? And so I knew that we had to put that in a broader framework of, this is racism in the United States, right? And the only way to do that was, or one of the only ways to do that would be to use critical race theory as the framing for what we're talking about. Because for us, it's not only some of these scientific issues with the use of these particular traits, as I just mentioned, but it's this broader issue of, if we estimate ancestry and we put that in our report, for us, we are doing a societal disservice. And that societal disservice is we are contributing to racism. And for me as an anthropologist, I no longer want to participate in that endeavor. And so we needed to use critical race theory. And just for people who aren't familiar with critical race theory, it was conceptualized by law scholars to combat the entrenched racism in law and in the criminal justice system in general, and it's been used successfully by a number of other disciplines to interrogate entrenched racism and entrenched biases in their own discipline, in their own scholarship, in their own ways, individual ways of thinking about the world. And for me, one of the most important things about it is that it talks about how entrenched racism is, that unless it affects us directly, we don't see it. And that's the structural part of it, right? That it's woven into the fabric of our society. And so if you are not a person with dark skin, if you're driving down the street and cop lights go on behind you, yeah, you might get a little anxious, you might get a little panicked, but it's because you don't want a ticket. It's not because you're afraid that you're going to get pulled over and you're going to get killed, or you're going to get, assaulted or accosted, right? That there's a totally different experience. And so if you are not a person who has those sorts of experiences on a daily basis, on a regular basis, you don't see it, right? Why would you? Because you're not confronted with it, right? It's not in your face, but that's part of it, right? And that's what critical race theory helps us to see is we've got to peel back these layers. And so John and I thought that using critical race theory to peel back the layers of the use of race estimation, the use of ancestry estimation in forensic anthropology was going to be a critical step towards affecting any kind of change at all.
May I just piggyback off of what you just said for a second?
Absolutely.
And I think it's important to note that part of why this particular theoretical framework, it's certainly not new to many different anthropologists and social scientists, but it's very new for forensic anthropology, in part because of the way in which forensic anthropology has been constructed probably since the early 1990s and a Supreme Court case that really put forensic science in the spotlight with regard to methodologies that forensic scientists use. And probably and people have tracked this, that since this particular court case, which is broadly referred to as Daubert, pretty much the bulk of research that has occurred from that time until the present day has been really methodologically heavy. Can forensic anthropologists back up the conclusions that they make with things like statistics, with error rates, the certainty of our findings? And so for a couple decades, including the time when Dr. DiGangi and I were both graduate students, there was an emphasis on doing really methodologically driven work so that you could be confident on your skeletal biology assessment. So how confident are you about your age estimate? How confident are you about your stature estimate? So on and so forth. And I think because of the way in which the field is developed with this emphasis on methods and technical skill, which has been one of the critiques about forensic anthropology, is that it is highly technical and that the anthropology is somewhere lost, right? This discussion has been going on for a long time. That's probably why there hasn't been engagement with these other kinds of theoretical frameworks that are sort of stock taking and like examining the field in terms of the big picture. And I think that I'll give the credit to Dr. DiGangi, who was really her idea to say, like, we need to engage this. And it really made our arguments and our thinking, at least in my case, just crystallize so much more when we're sort of free to, embed what we're doing with, other theory beyond just the technical side of the skeletal biology.
Yeah, without question. And as Dr. Bethard just said, we talk about this in the paper, how forensic anthropology has been accused of being atheoretical, to the point where, there's a book, Theoretical, basically theory in forensic anthropology, but it doesn't engage with this theory, right? It's not really engaging with social theory. And there are a number of forensic anthropologists now who are recognizing that this is a deficit in the field, and it's to our detriment as well that we're not. And we also kind of have this conversation or this struggle because, to a certain extent, there are many forensic anthropologists who are technical. This is what they do. They work in the lab, they work in a morgue, and they do casework all day, and they write reports for law enforcement or the government, or what have you. And so their point might be, well, what good is it? How is that going to help me identify the skeleton? How is that going to help me describe the skeleton? But my response to that would be, well, then like Dr. Bethard just said, then you're just a technician. Then you're not being an anthropologist. This is forensic anthropology. So there's got to be some anthropology in there somewhere. And so you might have a difference between what you're putting in your report, and maybe what your research question is about, but your research question is informing what it is ultimately that goes into your report. And so that theory, that social theory has got to be there, and we really need to embrace it as part of our discipline.
Yeah, and I'll just say that if people want to think about this another way, and this is not my idea, it's actually a graduate student from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign who came up with this idea in a previous webinar that happened back in February, where she really pinpointed the difference between forensic anthropology, which is, I think, what Dr. DiGangi and I are aspiring to do, versus, say, forensic osteology or forensic anatomy, right? Where we have this real divide amongst practitioners about which one you're supposed to do. Because the reality is, a lot of colleagues work on a lot of cases, and there's a need to provide information for the purpose of identification. And so there's probably a fallback on, well, I'm doing forensic osteology, therefore I need to do this because of the end goal that I'm working in to try to get people identified, and I see this as necessary.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and again, just thank you so much, because it really makes it seem very engaging to me as an anthropologist, as a topic within anthropology. And I on these notes, and maybe you've already spoken to this, but you do use the term, for example, white supremacy in your writing to refer to what's happening. And I was wondering if you could maybe even just expand a bit on the use of that term in particular and how that connects to some of what we've just been discussing.
Yeah, so we decided you need to name it for what it is, and there's some controversy among critical race theorists even as to whether or not that term should be used. Some people say it kind of raises a red flag, and people get scared immediately, and so they back off from that. But I'm of the mindset that white supremacy is what we're talking about. And so what do we mean by white supremacy? The entrenched systemic and structural differences that white people have put in place so that their superiority remains up here, right? And that everybody else is down here. And so we're not talking about, members of the Proud Boys. We're not talking about people who belong to the Ku Klux Klan. We're talking about just the structures that have been put in place that maintain the social order of primarily middle class, upper class, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, neurotypical men of being in charge. And so that group of people, up here with white woman, cisgendered, heterosexual, et cetera, right below that, right? And then everybody else kind of, falls in line, below that. And so anytime anyone tries to, push back against that order, of, white males being in charge, there's pushback, right? And so we decided that it was important to name it for what it is, because a lot of people, I think, don't understand that white supremacy is not just about the members of the Proud Boys. It's not just about the Ku Klux Klan. Those certainly are extreme examples, right? But white supremacy is also about the boardroom, where everyone in the room is, an upper class, millionaire, white male, cisgendered, heterosexual, right? That's white supremacy too. The fact that certain people have been excluded from those spaces is the definition of white supremacy. And so, you might have your token woman in, the boardroom of some, Fortune 500 company. You might have your token Black person. But when 80% of the room, 90% of the room, white males, that's white supremacy at work. And so thinking about how white supremacy has also influenced the academy and how it's influenced our own discipline. And this is the entire reason we have diversity and inclusion initiatives, in our departments at our universities, because while, we like to think that, as academics, as anthropologists, well, I'm not racist, I know better than that. For most of us, I think all we have to do is take a look around our departments and look at the makeup demographically of who's in our departments, who our students are, who's at the university, to see, yeah, there's some white supremacy happening here. And so we used it also to talk about, again, back to our hypothesis that if we mention an ancestry estimate in the report, that reinforces for the people, our clients who are reading the report, which is law enforcement, or people just in the broader medical legal death community, that reinforces for them their own biases about biological race and about there being these biological differences between people, and how potentially cases of anyone who's not white may go unidentified for longer. And again, this is a hypothesis. We do not have, this is a hypothesis for which we do need to gather evidence, but we base that hypothesis on evidence of racial bias in many other areas of law enforcement, from more Black boys being arrested for similar crimes than white boys when the same crime was committed, for more Black children being prosecuted as adults for similar crimes, for more children of color being recovered more slowly. That's horrible grammar. Less quickly than white children who were kidnapped or abducted. And it kind of goes on and on. All of those things, right, are evidence of white supremacy. And it doesn't have to be deliberate, right? The investigator maybe isn't deliberately saying, okay, hypothetically, right, I'm going to put this case, to the side for now. It can also be structural. So what about, precincts that might be in impoverished areas and they simply don't have the resources? So there's one investigator to do cold cases, as opposed to there really needs to be 5, given the number of cases that they may have. That's white supremacy too, right? That's structural racism at work as well. And so we did think it was important to, you can't start to deal with an issue unless you have recognition of what the issue is. You've got to face it, right? And this is true for everything, right? In our own personal lives, you want to lose weight, you've got to acknowledge, okay, I really got to eat too much candy, right? I got to knock off the sugar, knock off the late night ice cream or whatever. You have to acknowledge it. And so we thought it was important. We've got to acknowledge this. And that's the only way we're going to be able to move forward.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And it makes me, I know we've sort of talked sort of in passing about the reception that, you've had from forensic anthropology to your work. And I'm curious if maybe we could talk more about that. And because what you're saying here, which is interesting to me, is that you're saying racism, white supremacy is not just something that you can blame on an individual, but also just sort of opt out of as an individual. Like, I'm just not going to participate in this, right? I mean, it's structural in the sense that we have to, which means that when you call for a change, everybody's implicated. It means you have to actually make changes. And I'm curious how that relates to maybe some of the reception that you've received, because you've called for a couple different things. And I don't want to, I know I just somewhat in the interest of time here to make sure that we touch on some things. You've called, for example, for a moratorium on the use of morphoscopic traits. I know that's sort of a different thing, but you've called for some things, it seems, and you've used the term white supremacy. So I'm curious if we could just maybe discuss the reception and maybe some of the reasons for why you think the reception has been, what it has been.
So I'll start with that. I think it's fair to say that in my career, I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for Dr. DiGangi, but for myself, there's nothing I've ever written that has gotten the reaction to the editorial that came out in the summer. We knew what we were writing was moderately provocative for forensic anthropology, which is why we also chose to make that contribution an open access piece in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. And the day that it came in early view, how many correspondences, how many emails did we get the first day?
A lot.
A lot.
And
it was interesting because some of that feedback was, thank you for writing this. I've thought it all along. I've wondered it myself. I thought about this, but I didn't put it into words, or now what I've thought is something that is out there. This came from all corners. It came from our professional colleagues. It came from graduate students. It came from all parts of the United States, and it even came from folks abroad. At the same time, that very day, we got at least, I'm thinking of at least one note that vehemently disagreed with the comment. We also know that there was a response to our letter in the Journal of Forensic Sciences that a group of colleagues drafted, and 9 folks signed on to a response. And so I think that response indicates the variety of opinions on this topic in general, with morphoscopic traits specifically, or I should say morphoscopic traits in general, and ancestry estimates more specifically, or maybe I've reversed that, however it would be. But we've heard people who have affirmed what we've said, and we've had folks who completely disagree. In part because of the way in which we've framed of what we think is a really strong hypothesis, which I think many forensic anthropologists have just never considered. And it's probably because forensic anthropologists really haven't seen themselves as part of the medical legal system, and by extension, the criminal justice system, when really we're really embedded in it. We're part of it. We're just one piece of it. I mean, we referred to ourselves earlier in the AJPA piece as a cog, right? We're a cog in that wheel. And of course we are. And I think that it's something where we're very good at conducting analysis of other people, which is what we do. We physically analyze other individuals, but we can also be analyzed. And that's where some of the discord is coming from, I think, because the reflection that people are seeing or thinking about, they're not seeing it in a very good light, and they understand in some senses what we're saying, and then the argument is, well, that's not what I'm doing, right? I'm not doing that. I have very good intentions. I'm trying to get people identified. And so,
and sorry, John, to interrupt you, but the police officers I work with, they aren't racist. They're really nice people, right? They come to my lab, and so there's pushback on for that reason too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is that one of the reasons why I would say forensic anthropologists may have trouble identifying some of the biases in the criminal justice system. I feel like there is a lot of literature about this, but if you're working with these people every day, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll just jump in very quickly to say there's a tremendous amount of literature on this topic. There's even tremendous amount of literature in the bias related to missing persons investigations. In fact, a colleague who's in the same building as our department at USF, Dr. Brianna Fox, that's one of the areas that she studies. It's just literature that forensic anthropologists as a whole are not familiar with. We, for example, described something called missing white women syndrome, which is the phenomena for the media to over-report missing white women as compared to all of the other missing people. And I had forensic anthropologists, really competent and really good forensic anthropologists, who reached out to me to say, I've been doing this for however long, I've never even heard of it. Right? Because we're such in the lane, as I mentioned before, of the technical side of skeletal analysis. So it's out there, right? We're maybe making a link between what's out there and forensic anthropology specifically.
Right. Yeah, and I'll point out that people's ignorance of that also kind of highlights, that's part of structural racism too. I mean, all you have to do is turn on Nancy Grace. She has made millions of dollars because of missing white woman syndrome, right? I mean, name one Black little girl or Black woman who you know of who has gone missing in the United States. I can name several white women and white missing little girls, right? Because of that over media coverage, which would teach you essentially that it's only white women and white little girls who go missing. Obviously, that is not true, right? That just can't be true based on statistics alone. And so that's part of the insidiousness of structural racism, and that's where critical race theory again, can be brought in. I did see here that Diane had I think we answered part of your question, Diane. You're asking, have you seen any good faith efforts to start these conversations? And the answer is absolutely yes. I think this webinar is a really good example. The Society of Forensic Anthropologists, they put together a pretty incredible event that was in February of, I guess there was maybe about 50 or 60 forensic anthropologists, not only professionals, but also students involved. It was sort of a conversation, and they had a Google Doc where they had people post their questions, their comments, primarily reactions to the pieces that Dr. Bethard and I wrote. And they broke those down into, I guess, 7 or 8 sort of topics. And then they placed people in breakout rooms, and we had specific questions that we had to respond to. It was brilliantly done. It's absolutely, it must have taken them forever to put it together, but it was brilliantly done. And it was really an opportunity to be able to talk to colleagues and students in a way that we don't often get to have these kinds of conversations outside of a conference. And even in a conference setting, we're usually we're listening to someone talk and we're not engaging in a conversation. And that was an opportunity to engage in a conversation. The committee, I think it's Commission for Equity in Anthropology, they're doing a webinar that Dr. Bethard and I are engaging in at the end of the week. So there's absolutely been, I would say, several good faith efforts to start these conversations. I had a colleague at a medical examiner's office reach out to me to say, hey, got some questions. Are you ever available for a phone call? And we had a phone call, and then that kind of led to, we've set up a call for the rest of the people who are in that office, just so we can talk, right? I mean, that's kind of what we want to do. We just want to be able to have these conversations.
I'll also just quickly plug a webinar that Dr. DiGangi and several of her colleagues also organized. I mentioned this in the recording. So Dr. DiGangi, would you just briefly talk about your webinar, the other one that you did, and like the number of participants and what that was about?
Yeah, so we initially had organized a scientific session to be in concert with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting. And then because of some of the logistic restrictions, in part because of the pandemic, in part because of the virtual platform and the vendor that they were using, it got to a point where it just wasn't going to work for us to hold our symposium in concert in that forum, because we had really engaged. Yes, we're giving talks, but we had also envisioned having a discussant, and we asked Dr. Augustine Fuentes of Princeton University if he would be our discussant. And so we made the decision to just do a webinar and not, be in concert with the meetings. And that allowed us to have a much larger, because obviously it was free to attend. We had 1,000 people sign up because of weather issues at my colleague's institution, where her institution is located. We wound up just having a room for 500 people, and it was full at 500 pretty much the entire time. And she also live streamed it on YouTube. So it's possible we had well over 1,000. And I mean, I was just, at first we're like, oh, we just need a room 200, maybe we'll get 50 people, then all of a sudden it's packed at 500. And we were just absolutely beside ourselves. What kind of academic event gets 500 people, let alone 1,000? I mean, it was really remarkable. And so the webinar was called Blinded by the White: Forensic Anthropology and Ancestry Estimation. And we had several different talks. And again, with the discussant being Augustine Fuentes. It's an interesting webinar because we're not all on the same page with this whole topic of ancestry estimation. So, one of our colleagues opined in her talk that we need to, continue, but just call it something else. Another colleague opined that, no, we need to do it, but you need to be aware of who, sorry, you probably heard the squeaking. That's my dog's toy. It's better than him barking. That you need to be aware of where you live and who are the, the populations of people, the demographics of the people where you live. And then others like myself opine, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And so, there's absolutely a tension there. And so I do think that, for those who are really interested in this topic, and Dr. Bethard said that he mentioned where the link is. Did you talk about it in your recording? Or if somebody reaches out to me, I can send it to you if you're interested separately. I don't have it on me right at this moment in time, but it is still on YouTube.
Yeah, we'll make sure that perhaps that link for the webinar, it's a 3-hour event. So I don't anticipate anybody sitting down for 3 hours at a time, but the content was just really great. And that's where, when I previously mentioned the talk from our colleague at LSU, her paper and all the other papers are in that. There's also another really good talk in that series. For instance, Dr. Jesse Goliath is presenting a lot of literature that's talked about all of the examples of bias in the criminal justice system, for example. So it really covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, and I see that Dr. Jackson has a really excellent question here that I love. What have we learned from this process and participation with this group of anthropologists, and about how whiteness, permeates what is valued or prioritized through anthropology? The pushback, just the pushback, and how vehement some of that pushback has been. So I mentioned the Google Doc that the Society of Forensic Anthropologists set up, where people were able to give their comments and so forth, so they could put together their conversation event. And some of those comments in there, I mean, they were bordering on ad hominem, against myself and against Dr. Bethard. So just really vehement. We have to do ancestry. We can't, it's like the death grip of control that we were taught to do this, and we absolutely have to, and there's no way we can ever think about this any other way, right? So being completely like doors chained shut and soldered shut, like not even willing to let in, a sliver of light to say, well, maybe they've got a point, right? Now, certainly, I do have colleagues who have demonstrated that change of mind of, okay, maybe they've got a point. I'm willing to entertain this, right? But and I admire that, right? Because that's not easy to do when you sit down and you really take a hard look and you say, okay, maybe the way I've been thinking about this the entire time is wrong. But there are several who are just, no, I'm not even willing to think about this. There's absolutely no way the police are biased. There's no evidence for that. Meanwhile, some of that evidence that I just listed, and as Dr. Bethard mentioned, there are people who study this for a living. This is what they do. They study bias in the criminal justice system. And so the fact that people are willing to just, kind of pick and choose the lines of evidence that they're willing to go with, that's really reinforced for me personally the difficulty of you can't deal with it. And as I said before, until, if I'm not willing to admit that, I've got a problem with eating too many carbs, I'm not going to be able to deal with, the extra weight I've gained during the pandemic, right? Same thing with structural racism. If I'm not willing to admit that white fragility exists, and I just bought that book actually over the weekend at Barnes & Noble. It's excellent. Robin DiAngelo. I recommend it to everybody to read. If I'm not willing to admit that structural racism exists, we're not getting anywhere, right? We're not dismantling anything. So I would say that's what I've taken away from this process.
I'll piggyback off that and say for myself, what I've taken away is that the approach that how I learned about forensic anthropology as a graduate student, as a young professional, as a person who aspired and worked hard to pass our board certification exam, I realized that a lot of what I have done is not how I want to continue in the field. And it's not how I want to continue as a practitioner. And it's not how I want to continue as a teacher, as a person who might teach both undergraduate and graduate students. And so I haven't probably figured all of that out yet. Maybe neither of us have figured all of that out, but I certainly know what I'm changing in terms of what I view as a fact, that in order to be a forensic anthropologist, you've got to do ancestry estimation in the way that it's always been done. That's something that I'm changing and that I'm implementing, basically have implemented into my teaching moving forward. And I think that's a pretty big change from the emphasis that this has been placed, that is placed on this particular topic in the field. It takes up a lot of time. We spend a lot of time talking about it. And I think I'm going to be talking about it in a really different way, from now on.
That's great. Thank you so much. We do have very little time left, but I don't know if anybody had a question or wanted to chime in with anything. Because my final question for you both was just really, realistically, I'm sure, coming out of 2020, we're all trying to balance our optimism with reality here. Where do you think we're headed here? Where do you see the next steps? What do you see the next steps being? And do you see there being some realistic change in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I'm always kind of, well, not always, but I try to be optimistic. I think that we're really at a critical point. Not only just because of, this in the field, but because of what's happening in the world around us with current events. So, I hope that we don't lose the momentum. It's the kind of thing where you just have to keep up the momentum, even though it can be really difficult, because often, it's a few people who take this on their shoulders, and it's draining, right? I mean, I mentioned the weight gain over the pandemic, writing this paper, late at night while trying to teach had a lot to do with that, right? Eating cookies and chips, just to get me through, right? To feed, the emotions that were coming up as I was writing this. So, part of me kind of wants to, just retreat to the woods, to a cabin and make it all go away. But at the same time, I realize, I've got a responsibility, and all of us have a responsibility just to keep moving. We just got to keep moving the ball forward. Just got to keep moving it down the field. And sometimes you have a setback, but you just keep pushing forward. So, I don't know, it's not going to change overnight. But, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll see, but we just have to keep pushing. And, Dr. Bethard and I are both fortunate enough that we teach doctoral students. So a good number of the pushback that we're receiving are from forensic anthropologists who do not teach doctoral students. And so that's where a lot of the change happens too, right? With that legacy that we're able to pass on via our teaching of graduate students who will then go on to be the professors themselves.
And the practitioners
And
themselves too.
Yeah.
And I'll just quickly add that, it's been however many months since June, and I can tell, folks that, I've had colleagues that have at least said, we're changing our SOP, our standard operating procedure in our lab a little bit, right? I'm thinking of at least people have said, well, we're at least going to remove, for example, morphoscopic traits until we at least know a little bit more about them. So I'm thinking about those kinds of changes. I know that, probably since June, there have been more conversations in forensic anthropology on this topic on a national level that have connected people who otherwise might not have been connected. And I see that as a really remarkable amount of change. We have a long way to go, but we've seen there's pushback, but there is momentum. So I think we're focusing on the minds and the hearts of our colleagues that are changing or can be changed, and we're focusing on students. We're probably not going to spend as much time on the colleagues who aren't going to change at all, right? But we know that there's potential, particularly with future generations of forensic anthropologists where we have a real opportunity.
That's great. Well, I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but thanks really to both of you for being here. This has been just really interesting. It gives me a lot to think about, and thanks to everybody who came to and who was here to listen. I actually, it gives me optimism just to have everybody here and to be able to talk to all of you across our subfields. And I think, when you look at some of the pervasive power struggles that we're dealing with, like white supremacy in higher education, in the academy, the more we can speak across these boundaries, right? The more that we can actually compare what we're finding, what we're doing, and then use those things in our teaching as well. I think that's important, and it's going to be, I think, an important pathway forward for something to do. And of course, on that note, this is one of the reasons why Dr. Jackson and others in the department have really pushed this type of conversation and this Committee for Diversity and Inclusion. And so on that note, thanks everyone for being here. We will have more events coming up in the future. I'm going to end the recording at this point, but if you want to maybe stick around and just say hi to some of your friends, you could do that. So once again, thanks so much, and we'll wish you all a wonderful week. Stay safe.